Well, YouTube, it has certainly been a while. Rings of Power has inspired something of a creative analytical streak in me that has not been present for a couple of years, and I hope to take advantage of it for however long this video ends up being. I am going to dive right into things momentarily, but before I do, I will provide the smallest amount of context to ensure any potential biases are laid out on the table. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is, in my view, the single greatest work of cinema that has ever been made. I view the trilogy as a single cinematic piece, and I consider it as my personal favorite movie of all time. In spite of my adoration for Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, I have never read the Lord of the Rings novels by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is quite simply because I do not read books, and I do not read books because I find very little entertainment value from doing so, as juvenile as this may sound.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
So whilst I know the movies extremely well, I am by no means an expert or a purist when it comes to Tolkien's lore. As far as I'm concerned, and this goes for any adaptation of anything, deviations from the source material are perfectly fine, provided they are done specifically and deliberately to enhance the story being told in a way that makes sense, or to simplify it due to the various limitations posed by translating the work from page to screen. The reason I wanted to make this clear before starting the analysis is because I am not going to be making an adaptation argument. I am not interested in how accurately or inaccurately Rings of Power adapts Tolkien's source material. What I am interested in is how Rings of Power succeeds or fails to tell its own story, and how it does or does not follow the rules that it lays out for itself. So, with that out of the way, let's get started by looking at the episode chronologically. So in the opening scene, this run-of-the-mill schoolyard bullying feels out of place for elves, who are supposed to be the oldest, wisest, and fairest of all races. One would assume that the wisest of all races would be somewhat unlikely to produce children who bully each other in this manner. These kids knew that Galadriel was making an origami boat.
Well, is it finished yet?
And then they proceed to destroy it when she shows them, which suggests a degree of sadism. I'm not even being hyperbolic here, and I wouldn't consider this kind of thing to be out of place in a 1990s playground, but in Middle-earth, with elves, the oldest, wisest, and fairest of all races, it is definitely jarring. Galadriel then attacks the child who broke her origami boat, overpowers him, and prepares to punch him in the face before she is interrupted. This indicates that she is both capable of violence, emotionally fragile, and unable to negotiate her way out of disagreements, which may have avoided this exact scenario. Galadriel's brother Finrod then compliments her on her origami ship, which suggests that he was present the entire time and yet did not intervene earlier. This, once again, seems out of place for an elf. He then goes on to make a clunky metaphor about rocks looking down and boats looking up, which I think is supposed to teach Galadriel to be good, in a generic sense. She asks,
"How am I to know which lights to follow?"
And he whispers a reply in her ear. We don't know what he says until later, so for now I will move on. Finrod then says,
"But you must learn to discern them for yourself. I won't always be here to speak them to you."
I can only assume that he either knew he was going to be killed in the next scene, or that he had forgotten that, as elves, both he and his sister are immortal and thus do not age and cannot die from natural causes.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
So as I go through the series, I thought it might be a good idea to note the key character traits, both positive and negative, of each main character. This will help make any discrepancies more apparent and will help keep track of what we have learned from each character in each scene. So here we have learned that Galadriel is not interested in socializing with others, extremely talented at origami, is unable to negotiate her way out of disagreements, and is violent and impulsive. So now we get a history lesson which will serve to set up the state of Middle-earth that the series will take place in. Morgoth, described here only as the Great Foe, destroyed the light of their home, referring to the elves. The elves then fought back and traveled from Valinor to Middle-earth. Pay attention here to the distance from Valinor to Middle-earth. I am highlighting this for no particular reason. Anyway, the war between the elves and Morgoth lasted for centuries before he is eventually defeated. However, some of you may recall a character from the movies.
Oh, I
Morgoth's most devoted servant, the cruel and cunning sorcerer Sauron. Galadriel's brother Finrod vowed to seek and destroy Sauron, but instead Sauron seeked and destroyed Finrod first. Sauron drew an E on him, and none of the elves understood the purpose of this. Galadriel then decided that she would succeed where her brother had failed, and she would now seek and destroy Sauron. Galadriel was unable to locate Sauron for centuries. The closing line of this narration is, "For many elves, the pain of those days passed out of thought and mind. More and more of our kind began to believe that Sauron was but a memory, and the threat at last was ended. I wish I could be one of them." So that was a big chunk of exposition which needs more than a little criticism. This narration is the setup for the world of the show. To help me dissect this, I'm going to compare the prologue in Rings of Power to the prologue in one of my favorite movies, Fellowship of the Ring. Now, I'm going to try to avoid direct comparisons between Rings of Power and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because regardless of how good or bad Rings of Power is, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is beloved. It has stood the test of time, and as I said earlier, it is among the best cinematic work ever made. So however you slice it, Rings of Power is at a severe disadvantage. Anyway, in Rings of Power, we learn nothing of Morgoth's motivation, only that he is the great foe. Conversely, in Fellowship, we explicitly learn that Sauron is deceitful, cruel, malicious, and wants to dominate all life. We also implicitly learn that Sauron is patient, as his plan to trick everyone with rings is something of a long con. An added bonus here is that we actually see Sauron battling the elves and men and can get an idea of his power level. We don't ever see Morgoth in battle. In fact, we don't ever see Morgoth at all. I wonder if there's a reason for that. Anyway, in Rings of Power, we learn that Morgoth destroyed, quote, the light of our home, which could either mean he literally destroyed Valinor, which can't be the case as we find out later, or it could mean he destroyed their magical glowing trees. What these are, beyond a metaphor for goodness, is never explained. Morgoth's vague destruction of the light of our home is the motivation for the entire conflict between the elves and Morgoth. We learn that the elves and the orcs battled for centuries before the elves won, and Morgoth was defeated. Off-screen. In Fellowship, we learn that the Great Rings were forged and distributed amongst the elves, dwarves, and men, and we are told some baseline information about each of those races. We learn why these rings were forged. We learn that, in secret, Sauron forged a master ring inside Mount Doom with the intention of controlling the other rings. We learn that this caused a last alliance of elves and men to fight back against Sauron, the phrase last alliance implying something of the subsequent relationship between the elves and the men. In Rings of Power, we learn that Finrod tried and failed to defeat Sauron, but we have no indication as to how long this took, how this happened, why this happened, or why or how his body was recoverable.
Well, he ain't getting any deader.
Something like this would usually be a bit of a nitpick, but in this case it is so crucial to the plot that Galadriel finds the magical E carved into Finrod's skin. So yeah, this was definitely consequential, and they skipped over it. In Fellowship, we have the entire character arc of Isildur, which I am not even going to start talking about because it would make this video twice as long as it's already going to be. In Rings of Power, we learn that Galadriel was unable to even locate Sauron after centuries, which would suggest that either she is terrible at tracking him compared to her brother, or that Sauron is suddenly fantastic at hiding. And finally, we learn that a significant number of elves have forgotten that Sauron exists, and that therefore he was not a threat anymore. But not Galadriel. She has a job to do. So I think it's fair to say that we learn a huge amount more from the prologue of Fellowship than we do from the prologue of Rings of Power. Efficient storytelling isn't everything, but what we did learn from Rings of Power consisted mostly of contrivances and areas of unjustified vagueness, likely nothing to do with the extremely restrictive limitations of purchasing the adaptation rights to the appendices of Return of the King and not the rights to any of Tolkien's other works. So, continuing with Rings of Power, we see Galadriel and her team climbing a giant ice wall. Firstly, I don't believe that this was the only way up here. Secondly, if this is indeed the only way up here, why is Galadriel not using any kind of climbing equipment? The other elves have climbing gear. She has a knife. And spiky shoes.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
When they reach the top, Galadriel dramatically redraws her knife and points it at the map to remind herself and the audience of where she is going. Okay then. She is then interrupted by one of her companions who tells her that although they have followed her to the edge of the world, he doubts they will be able to find Sauron. He says that no one has seen an orc in years and that the other elven commanders believe Sauron is no more. He suggests that they camp here and travel home in the morning. I should remind you that here is supposedly the peak of a mountain during what appears to be a blizzard, and yet this guy isn't even raising his voice, almost like they are on a soundstage. Anyway, his suggestion of traveling home in the morning at this point is pretty absurd. The show seems to suggest that he and the other elves were getting pretty sick and tired of following Galadriel on her wild Sauron chase, and this icy death wall in a blizzard was the final straw. So rather than have this conversation before climbing the giant icy death wall, they decided to climb up and then plan to simply do it again but backwards in the morning.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Anyway, Galadriel doesn't care about any of what this guy is saying because she is the main character. Okay. I'll be a bit more charitable. She doesn't care about any of what this guy is saying because she is a cunt. So now we have highly motivated to the point of obsession, disregard for her own life and the lives of her companions, and extremely talented at climbing. In the next scene, the blizzard continues. Galadriel shows a degree of compassion for one of her companions who had just fallen over, which is odd given that moments ago she seemed not to care that they were all risking their lives every minute of every day by staying with her.
You really should have thought of that before you became peasants.
One of the other elves says that they are clearly in the wrong place, as the location they seek does not appear to be here. Then Galadriel observes that they are clearly in the right place, as the location they seek does in fact appear to be here.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
They accidentally themselves into the right place. Anyway, venturing inside, Galadriel informs both us as the audience and her elven companions that this spooky castle is where the orcs gathered after Morgoth's defeat. How she knows this, given that
None who ever dared search for this last stronghold has ever found anything.
is not explained, or, possible, unless an orc told her, I guess. Another elf comments that he has no feeling in his hand, presumably due to frostbite or similar. And Galadriel informs us that the level of evil in this spooky castle is so high that fire doesn't give off heat. She is asked how she knows this, and she responds that
it's colder than the rest.
So in Middle-earth, they've established that there is a correlation between temperature and level of evil, I guess. So, given that they have just been traveling for an undetermined amount of time, have climbed a giant icy death wall, and hiked through a blizzard, these elves must be exhausted. Galadriel's intention, if she is correct after having gauged the evil meter by measuring how cold the spooky castle is to locate Sauron within the castle and defeat him. This is the best case scenario for her. This is the potential culmination of her vow, which, need I remind you, has taken her centuries. And she is here with 8 exhausted elves. Sound like a bad idea? Anyway, Galadriel then punches through some ice with ease. My god, is there anything this gal can't do?
Let me guess, you have a great personality.
Then they discover a spooky orc corpse glued to a wall. Nothing really to say about this, so anyway, Galadriel then finds another E. She then tells her boys to rest because Lord knows they need it. Good thing Sauron wasn't just kind of chilling in here waiting. Galadriel then explains that the E was left as a mark for orcs to follow.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
So this makes no sense in just about every way. Galadriel has encountered 2 of these marks, one on her brother's corpse and one here on this table. Therefore, she concludes, they are magic signposts for the orcs to follow.
What does that have to do with me?
No. He's got a point.
Therefore, she must also follow them in order to locate Sauron. Is this some map to Luke Skywalker bullshit again? Anyway, even if these marks are in fact signs for orcs to follow, it is absurd that Galadriel can possibly know this. She has literally 0 information to base this on. Okay, so we learned that Galadriel is extremely physically strong, has godlike powers of deduction. So it's been about 15 minutes and we are about a quarter of the way through the episode, and that means it's right about time for an action scene. There is a in the dungeon! And it proceeds to annihilate the elves. I don't really know the relative power levels of the elves in Rings of Power yet because the show hasn't told me.
Don't know, don't care. How's that?
But let's just say if Legolas had been hit by the cave troll in Fellowship to anything like this degree, it would have killed him. So anyway, Galadriel just kind of sits back and watches her entire party get thrown around and crushed by this troll before her buddy uses his sword to catapult her at the troll, because she alone can defeat it, because she is the best, you see. Teamwork is not required when you have a Mary Sue. Oh wait, I can't call them that anymore, can I? Teamwork is not required when you have a flawless, emotionless, invincible audience surrogate character with boobs. I'm not going to waste time on the specifics of the fight scene. There are other people who can do that far better than I can, so I will stick entirely to what this scene tells us. Galadriel is able to defeat this snow troll without breaking a sweat. She defeats it literally in 10 seconds. Now to draw another convenient comparison from, Fellowship, we see the entire Fellowship struggle immensely to defeat the cave troll in Moria. I guess if Galadriel had been the 10th member of the Fellowship, then when the troll busts down the door in Balin's tomb, she would have cut off its head in 10 seconds flat. And then presumably have done the same thing with the Balrog. We then see that all 8 of Galadriel's companions did in fact survive this encounter with the troll, which I guess means that this is just a flesh wound according to an elf. Good to know. Anyway, turns out this troll encounter was the final straw for her party, all of whom decide finally to abandon her to her quest alone. This doesn't seem to faze Galadriel whatsoever. And understandably so, as not one of her party have actually contributed anything to her quest from what we have seen. Quite literally, every single thing we have seen in the last 10 minutes or so that progressed her quest was accomplished entirely and exclusively by Galadriel herself. Totally not a Mary Sue, extremely skilled at using a sword, can 1v1 a control. We now journey to Rovanion, the Wilderlands east of the Anduin, and we see two odd-looking fellows complaining about wolves. Then they discuss how dangerous Harfoots are. As we will find out, Harfoots are essentially proto-hobbits. If we do the smallest amount of external reading, which I'm not intending to do at any other point in this review, we will see that Harfoots are one of 3 species of hobbits. They will never be referred to as hobbits, however, which no doubt would have been far better for marketing purposes, leading me to believe that there may be other legal reasons for never using the word hobbit. So these Harfoots seem to be nomadic travelers who are essentially hobbits in every other way. We are also introduced to Nori, and we learn that she is brave, curious, she doesn't follow the rules, and she is rather clumsy. Okay, so Nori is brave, doesn't follow the rules, curious, can be clumsy. We now leave Nori and the Harfoots and we meet Elrond. We see him writing what is either a poem or a story before he is interrupted, and he suggests that he didn't want to be found. The messenger tells him that he can't come to the next council meeting due to his not being an elf lord. He doesn't respond to this, and this has no bearing on anything else in either this scene nor this episode, so I can only assume that the writers decided that mentioning a council in the scene introducing Elrond was an easy way to remind the audience of who he is. Elrond then meets with Galadriel, who has now returned from the mountain castle, and the two appear to be very good friends. Elrond talks to Galadriel about how crossing over to Valinor feels like being immersed in a light more intoxicating than any sensation in all of Middle-earth.
It's as satisfying to me as coming is.
Galadriel responds by saying that when she was a child, that was the only feeling she knew.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
So in the first scene with Galadriel, we see her get bullied and get into a physical altercation due to her being unable to control her emotions. I guess she was feeling like being immersed in an intoxicating light when she was right about to turn this kid's face into lasagna.
I'm like getting the feeling of coming.
Either that or she's lying to her good friend Elrond. Or alternatively, the writers are just trying desperately to hammer home how much Galadriel misses the light of the Valinor to justify her obsessive hunt for Sauron, which whilst may be in and of itself true in terms of motivating her, what she just said was simply false. So Elrond, we learn, is creative, likes time to himself, seems to be light-hearted and relaxed, seemingly very open and friendly with Galadriel. And Galadriel is commander of the northern armies, warrior of the wastelands. Galadriel then explains to Elrond her findings in the spooky castle. She says that the magic E proves that Sauron escaped. I would have assumed that she already knew that Sauron escaped given that no corpse has turned up in the last few hundred years, and given that she has actively been hunting him for centuries, which presumably required there to be other clues and leads as to his potential whereabouts. I assume that she wasn't just walking around aimlessly for centuries. Anyway, the presence of the magic E does not prove that Sauron escaped. If we assume that the magic E can only be or is only used by Sauron, then it proves that at some point he was in the spooky castle, which Galadriel already knew.
Why me? Why me?
Oh well. She then demands that Elrond take him to the High King so that she can get more elven soldiers to hunt Sauron with her, even though the last 8 served literally no purpose.
I am not some courtier to be placated by idle flattery. I demand to speak with the king directly. Are you going to arrange an audience or not?
Rude. Back to the Harfoots. We learn in this scene that Nori is brave, courageous, and doesn't follow the rules. Again. So this scene should have been cut, I guess. So Nori doesn't follow the rules. She's clumsy, curious, and brave. Back to Lindon now, where High King Gil-Galad is honoring Galadriel and her companions for returning from their quest. He explains that their return indicates that their days of war are over, which I assume means he has decided to forget that Sauron ever existed. As we will find out later, though, this is not the case. Anyway, Galadriel momentarily considers defying the High King to continue her quest for Sauron, but ultimately decides to accept his ceremonial crown. Gil-Galad says that Galadriel and her companions are to be rewarded by returning to the undying lands of Valinor, even though their magic tree is dead, which probably should have been explained a little better. Or is it now alive because Morgoth is dead and that undoes whatever evil stuff he did? As we will soon find out, we won't find out.
Don't know, don't care. How's that?
Anyway, Galadriel tells Elrond in private she is going to refuse this reward and will pursue Sauron alone. Elrond reveals that he showed the magic E to the High King, and that they determined that seeing this sigil does not mean that she is actually any closer to finding Sauron.
Very good, Kronk.
So we have to wonder, why is Galadriel so utterly convinced that evil is still out there?
The evil is gone.
Then why is it not gone from in here?
So if I understand this correctly, her reasoning is that she just kind of feels like it's still there.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Okay, Elrond's response is that he understands her being conflicted, which is an odd thing to say because she has demonstrated that she is very much not conflicted. And Galadriel's response to this is to demean and insult Elrond.
I am grateful you have not known evil as I have, but you have not seen what I've seen.
I have seen my share.
You have not seen. Evil does not sleep, Elrond. It waits. And in the moment of our complacency, it blinds us.
Because, yeah, you know your place, little elf boy. I'm the commander of the Northern Army, and I've been hunting Sauron for like half a millennia, and I found my magic E, and also I kill trolls with my eyes closed, so what do you know? And even though what she is saying is utterly unfounded, it will of course turn out that she is absolutely correct, because even though at this point I have no idea which direction the show will go, we know that Sauron returns. So she is right because the script says she's right, I guess. Elrond then convinces Galadriel for now that it would be a bad idea to lead more elves to die in search of Sauron. So I understand what the writers are doing here, but firstly, from what we have seen, elves are basically impervious to troll attacks, so it must be pretty damn hard to kill them. And secondly, I don't entirely believe that Galadriel cares how many elf corpses she leaves in her wake because she is hunting what essentially amounts to Satan, and she has shown little regard for their safety previously. Then Galadriel says this.
And in the west, you think my fate would be better, where song would mock the cries of battle in my ears. You say I have won victory over all the horrors of Middle-earth, yet you would leave them alive in me, to take with me.
So, again, it's a little hard to tell because this woman lacks the chromosome required for acting, but I think what she is saying is that she's been so traumatized by what she has seen since arriving at Middle-earth that returning to Valinor to live forever in elf heaven would not heal her, even though as far as I can tell, all of the other elves in the show have already forgotten the evil of Morgoth and Sauron, even though in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo travels to Valinor because of the extreme things he endured both physically, psychologically, and spiritually throughout the trilogy. But I guess whatever Galadriel experienced off-screen was worse than that by a large margin?
Pretty pathetic, huh?
Okay. Anyway, to further convince her to go to Valinor, Elrond says that if there is even a hint of Sauron in the future, he will not rest until it is put right. He asks her to put up her sword as she has fought for long enough. Her response is,
Without it, what am I to be?
Without my rifle, I am useless.
She's kind of correct here. Her sword does have more of a personality than she does. So Galadriel seems willing to bow to authority if needed, is apparently severely traumatized, and considers fighting to be her only purpose in life. We then travel to the Southlands, the lands of men, and are introduced to our first human characters. We see mysterious cloaked figures entering the village. One of them walks past two guys playing what appears to be a variation of chess. He barely glances at the game and then tells the guy he can win in 3 turns. Whoever this guy is, he's displaying unfathomable levels of Rain Man.
Do you know what autistic is?
Yeah.
You know that word?
Yeah.
He enters the pub and receives a distinctly cold welcome. Everyone seems to be very cautious of him. And we learn that he is Arondir, an elven soldier as part of a force occupying the human settlement. The barman informs Arondir that a farmer passed through a few days prior reporting potentially poisoned crops and that he is now only able to grow weeds as a result.
Oh, right. The poison for Cusco.
As Arondir asks for further information, a local yells at him, telling him to
Let it go, knife is.
This is a curious insult, as the elves in Middle-earth do not have knife ears, so whilst this may make sense in something like the Elder Scrolls, Warcraft, or Dragon Age, this slur is not accurate to the world in which it has been shoehorned. The local complains that Arondir is lumping them in with another group of humans that died off 1,000 years ago. He then continues with,
When are you people gonna let the past go?
So this is something of a contemporary line of dialogue which references 20th century race relations in America and is made even more blunt due to the fact that the character of Arondir is portrayed by a black actor. This is, of course, entirely appropriate for an adaptation of a book written by an Englishman with quintessentially English themes and influences. I guess that's what happens when Americans adapt something. We then follow Arondir outside and we meet Bronwyn. Bronwyn is a human girl who appears to be in her early to mid-20s, and we learn that she and Arondir are in some kind of relationship and that they are trying to conceal this relationship from the other people in the village. Arondir then returns to his outpost and learns that it is being disbanded on order from High King Gil-Galad. Another elf feels the need to make sure that the audience understands that this means that Arondir and Bronwyn will be separated, and says,
"We're leaving."
Because when the show is rated for ages 13 and up, I guess that means it's literally written for 13-year-olds. Anyway, we learn that Arondir has been stationed at this outpost for 79 years. We have no idea how old he is because elves don't age visibly, but we can assume he's at least 100, but likely far, far older. Why do I bring this up? Well, if he's been visiting the village for 79 years, then he has known Bronwyn, or at least known of her for her entire life, which means he waited for her to be of age and then decided it was time for some forbidden romance. This isn't necessarily a problem, but I could understand someone finding it rather creepy. Anyway, before he has to leave, Arondir visits Bronwyn and disobeys his superior in the process. He confesses his love for her before they are interrupted by a farmer. Holy coincidence, Batman. A farmer suffering from the same problems as the person that Arondir was trying to acquire information on earlier, or it may even be the same farmer, we simply don't know, has just shown up at Bronwyn's house at exactly the same time as him. I can only assume that this will be plot critical, because otherwise why else would the writers display their incompetence so brazenly? Arondir and Bronwyn discover then that the farmer's cow has black goo. No, not that black goo. And they rush off to Hordern, which is the place where the farmer thinks the cow may have went, possibly. The farmer doesn't actually know, because if he found the cow in Hordern, then he would have said, "I found the cow in Hordern," but instead he says,
"She might have made it as far as Hordern."
This means he has no idea, but I guess Hordern it is, so off they go. And yes, you heard me, I said they. Bronwyn joins Arondir on his epic quest of epicness, even though it means abandoning her child. I guess we now know where her priorities are. So Arondir has godlike cognitive ability. He is not quick to anger. He is physically capable. He avoids violence where possible. He is soft-spoken. He was previously a grower, which I assume is a farmer. He prioritizes love over duty. And Bronwyn prioritizes her elf BF over looking after her child. We then get a strange scene with Bronwyn's son and the racist guy from the pub. Bronwyn's son appears to have brought the racist guy to a barn in the town to show him what appears to be an evil sword. The evil sword has the magic E on it, which, if I understand correctly, means that orcs will be using this sword as a signpost.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
It also means that Sauron has been here.
What does that have to do with anything?
No. He's got a point.
And it also means that Sauron is definitely still alive.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Anyway, nothing else really happens here besides revealing that the whole town knows about Bronwyn and Arondir, so for now this scene just appears to be set up for something to come later. In the next scene, Gil-Galad tells Elrond that he had foreseen that if he had let Galadriel continue hunting Sauron, she might have inadvertently kept Sauron alive. My first observation is that foresight doesn't seem to be very useful if the best it can do is might have.
Pretty pathetic, huh?
And my second observation is that this means Gil-Galad knew that Sauron was still out there. Galadriel can't accidentally keep alive the very evil she sought to defeat if that evil is already defeated, which Gil-Galad claimed was the case either through ignorance, a bad memory, or deliberate manipulation. So what this means is that Gil-Galad explicitly knows that Sauron is still alive. Elrond doesn't seem very surprised either at this revelation. The show doesn't give us too much time to ponder that, as Gil-Galad tells Elrond that he is going to be working with Celebrimbor, a legendary elven smith who has a super important project he is working on. Back to the Harfoots, we learn in this scene that Nori is brave, curious, and doesn't follow the rules, again. So this scene also could have been cut, I guess. Nori is brave, clumsy, doesn't follow the rules, and is curious and brave. Anyway, we then continue with Arondir and Bronwyn's journey to Hordern. We learn that Bronwyn is very familiar with Hordern and the people who live there, as she was born there herself. They then suddenly notice a giant plume of smoke rising over the hill. Why didn't they see this until just this very second? Well, you see, if it was off camera and out of shot, This means it didn't exist until we as the audience could see it. So, as the music climaxes and the two lovers rush up the hill to tragically reveal Hordern has been burned to the ground, Bronwyn's reaction to her childhood home being razed and its people presumably killed or abducted.
Hordern.
Yeah, that's it. Moving on. Cut to the plastic elves on their green screen boat. Turns out Galadriel was convinced by Elrond to sail to Valinor. Her and her companions are ceremonially stripped of their armor, and after some resistance, Galadriel gives up her dagger too.
Without my rifle, I am useless!
The other elves all begin singing what is presumed to be part of this ceremonial return to Valinor, and Galadriel is notably the only one not singing. Something is clearly on her mind. Whatever will she do? Galadriel recalls what her brother Finrod had said to her centuries ago when she was a child about knowing which light to follow. His reply to her was that sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness. So because Galadriel has now metaphorically touched the darkness, off-screen, maybe, at some point, probably, she now knows what to do. She grabs her dagger and launches herself off the boat and into the ocean. For fuck's sake. I was willing to give a lot of this episode a pass, but this is full-on retarded. Look at this goddamn map from the beginning of this goddamn show. She is in the middle of the goddamn ocean. She is hundreds of miles from shore. She has no food. She has no water. She is wearing a long flowing robe, which is one of the worst things you could possibly be wearing when swimming. Galadriel has just committed suicide. She is going to fucking drown. So while all this was going on, there was a fiery comet that flew across Middle-earth, and where could it possibly land? Could it be next to one of our established characters? Why, yes, it certainly could. Nori, who, if you recall, is brave, curious, and doesn't follow the rules, approaches the impact site and sees what appears to be a man lying motionless on the ground. That's our hook for the next episode then, ladies and gentlemen. So, that was what actually happened in the show, and I'm now going to look back at each scene and try and determine what the writers wanted or needed to accomplish with each scene, and see how they did. So scene 1 is Galadriel's boat. This scene needed to establish that Galadriel's childhood was a magical and enchanting time of her life that took place in the perfect and heavenly place that is Valinor. That Galadriel is a bit of a loner and not like the other kids, but one who is willing and able to physically handle herself in a fight, and to establish that she has a loving relationship with her brother Finrod, and set up the metaphor involving rocks, ships, and lights. I believe that the writers intended to contrast her childhood with later scenes where she compares the various evils she has experienced in Middle-earth off-screen to her perfect childhood. This fails on account of showing that she was clearly not particularly happy as a child, and she is depicted as a victimized outcast waiting for her chance to shine. She seemingly can't wait to grow up. The writers succeeded in displaying Galadriel's willingness and ability to fight by showing her attacking and overpowering another child. But as I have already explained, this is slightly jarring considering that these are supposed to be elven children. And finally, the metaphor involving rocks going down and ships going up doesn't really make any sense, as I have explained previously. The scene ends with Finrod telling Galadriel to come along now, mother and father are waiting. Which is good, as it indicates that Finrod actually had a reason to be in this scene rather than just randomly hanging around until it's time for him to say his lines. I will skip over the prologue as I already spent a fair amount of time detailing the issues with it, and the purpose of the prologue is to literally spoon-feed necessary information directly to the audience. So there isn't really much I can draw on in terms of what the writers succeeded or failed at, as all they needed to do was tell us what they wanted to tell us, which they did. So scene 3 is Galadriel on the mountain and then in the Stronghold. This scene needed to establish that Galadriel and her 8 companions are going to extreme lengths to locate and defeat Sauron, as they have been doing for centuries. It needed to establish that her companions doubt that Sauron even exists, and that they are gradually less and less willing to continue on their dangerous quest. It needed to establish that Galadriel is utterly single-minded in her obsessive desire to defeat Sauron, as well as being extremely strong, extremely smart, and extremely resourceful. It needed to set up that the orcs and Sauron had been engaged in some kind of dark sorcery that the elves cannot identify. And finally, Galadriel needed to find the mark of Sauron inside the castle so as to give her a lead on further pursuing Sauron. So this scene is an absolute goddamn mess when it comes to cause and effect. Her companions are willing to engage in an absurd death-defying climb up a sheer cliff during a blizzard, all while they appear to be on the verge of telling her that enough is enough, it's time to go home.
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
What happened before the scene started? Presumably they had a similar argument where they said, should we really be climbing that? Our enemy is no more, let's go home. And Galadriel would then reply, no, we must continue. And then they just kind of do. Or are we expected to believe that they were totally on board with her, but that mountain made them change their minds entirely? Either way, eventually the other elves do abandon her after the fight with the snow troll. I think what the writers were trying to communicate here was that the snow troll was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that they were unwilling to further put their lives at risk in service of Galadriel's quest. The problem here is that Galadriel watched them get beaten up by the troll, and then saved them when it suited her by defeating it single-handedly in 10 seconds flat. So from their perspective, yes, she did put their lives in unnecessary peril because she didn't seem to show any urgency in saving them from the troll. However, I don't believe that the writer's intent was to display Galadriel's lack of concern for the lives of her companions. The scene does succeed in showing that Galadriel is extremely strong, extremely smart, and extremely resourceful, as she accomplishes literally everything entirely on her own. But this absurd lack of any character flaws beyond an obsessive compulsion to do the right thing makes this character more than a bit of a joke.
Let me guess, you have a great personality.
And finally, the logical gaps that Galadriel makes regarding the Mark of Sauron are absurd because she draws on information she can't possibly know and bases her claims on absolutely nothing. The writers wanted her to be the one person piecing everything together, but this is a terrible way to do this because it does not make sense. Scene 4 introduces us to the Harfoots. This scene needed to establish that Harfoots are a resourceful, superstitious, and simple race that hide from the other peoples of Middle-earth and keep their noses out of other people's business. And it also needed to establish that Nori is brave, curious, caring, that. This scene is pretty easy to digest because it simply shows us that the Harfoots are resourceful in hiding from the travelers, and the dialogue tells us that they are superstitious. We are also told explicitly, and not for the last time, that Nori is curious, caring, clumsy, doesn't follow the rules. Not much else to say here, as this is entirely set up and doesn't interact with anything else. Yet. Scene 5 is Elrond and Galadriel. This scene needed to establish that Elrond is also a bit of a loner, and that he is very good friends with Galadriel, that Galadriel considers her childhood to have been an ecstasy of perfection, that she is desperate to get back out there and find Sauron, and that Galadriel's actions previously on the mountain were in defiance of the High King. I think Elrond comes off pretty well in this scene in terms of his character traits and motivations. He is shown to care deeply for Galadriel, he is very respectful of her, and he is interested in her as a person as well as her accomplishments. If this were the only information conveyed in this scene, then I would believe that Elrond and Galadriel are good friends. Unfortunately, friendships require two people, and Galadriel, on the other hand, does not seem to feel the same way. She is initially respectful. Then she talks about herself.
When I was a child, it was the only feeling I knew.
She seems very pretentious and self-obsessed.
I half expected you to arrive caked in grime.
This time frostbite and troll blood.
She has no interest in spending any time with her supposed very good friend.
Must you speak of leaving again so soon?
You know very well why I must.
She is rude, she is blunt, she makes demands of Elrond.
I demand to speak with the king directly.
And talks down to him repeatedly.
Are you going to arrange an audience or not?
It doesn't always have to be about you.
All of this makes me wonder what on earth Elrond, or anyone else for that matter, sees in her. There is nothing to like. There is no reason I can think of why this woman would have any friends at all, let alone any very good friends. Overall, this scene shows Galadriel to be unconcerned with anything and anyone that is not her and her quest, and shows Elrond to be overly caring and courteous, even when faced with people like Galadriel, who he claims to call friend. The writers don't seem to have realized that by writing Galadriel in this way, with one single character trait and an obsessive laser focus on one single thing, they are making it impossible to build any other characters off her. You may tell me that Elrond and Galadriel are very good friends, but I simply do not believe you. Scene 6 is further exploration of Nori. This scene establishes that Nori is fucking again? We also learn that her father seems to be unconcerned with her daughter's behavior, whilst her mother is worried and wants to steer Nori away from any concerns beyond the Harfoots' immediate interests. This scene doesn't need to establish any of this, because all of this information was already communicated in the previous Harfoots scene, either through explicit dialogue or through visual presentation. This scene does not advance the plot or characters in any way, so I have absolutely no idea why it wasn't cut. Scene 7 is the ceremony. This scene needed to establish that Galadriel is momentarily willing to kneel before the High King and put her ego aside, recognizing his authority. It needed to establish that Galadriel is to be sent back to Valinor, meaning that she can no longer pursue Sauron.
You're being let go, your department's being downsized, you're part of an outplacement, we're going in a different direction.
And that she is unhappy with this. It needed to establish that her intention is to refuse the High King's will, and that Elrond considers this to be a mistake. It needed to establish that Galadriel has an intense level of PTSD, which acts as a further motivation for her. What this scene accomplishes is informing us that Galadriel is so committed to doing the right thing that she will refuse both an order from the High King and the greatest honor that elves can possibly receive. She is such a good person, guys. She is such a good person. so noble, and yet so rude.
I am grateful you have not known evil as I have, but you have not seen what I've seen.
I have seen my share.
You have not.
I already dissected much of the dialogue here, so I won't repeat myself. I will say, though, that as with the previous Elrond and Galadriel scene, their friendship continues to be very much one-sided. Scene 8 is the introduction of Arondir. This scene needed to establish that Arondir is a calm, measured, and soft-spoken elven soldier. It needed to establish that there has been some kind of poisoning. It needed to establish that there are racial tensions between elves and men. It needed to establish that Arondir is in a forbidden, potentially doomed relationship with Bronwyn, a human woman who serves as a medic. It also needed to establish that the elves are being sent away from the village, thus causing conflict for Arondir. So the introduction of Arondir is at the very least mildly interesting. The first thing we see him do is show off his supreme intellect before discussing a potential poisoning with the barman. This shows him to be very confident, a bit of a dick, but very dedicated when it comes to doing his job. The setup of his relationship with Bronwyn is not handled particularly well, as he doesn't seem too concerned with hiding it, despite being very aware that there is a significant likelihood that he, she, or both of them will be killed if they are discovered.
Only twice in known history has a pairing between elves and humans even been attempted. It ended in death.
You need not remind me.
This, I think, is supposed to convey how intensely Arondir feels for Bronwyn, but instead he is directly putting her life at risk by having anything to do with her, which you could definitely describe as selfish and short-sighted. I won't say too much on the racial tension front, but we have 3 separate indicators that this is present. Firstly, we have the drunken local reeing about you people, which firstly is not how racists behave, secondly is not appropriate dialogue for a fantasy show set in Middle-earth, and thirdly is about as blunt of a means of communicating racial tensions as you could possibly come up with. This scene does accomplish more than simply informing us of the racial tensions, however, as we do learn a good amount about Arondir's character. The second is an entire 90-second conversation between Arondir and the Watchwarden, in which the Watchwarden tells Arondir that as far as he is concerned, humans are evil subhumans, or sub-elves, I guess would be the term. Contrary to the first scene, this scene exists solely to tell us that there are racial tensions between elves and men. This scene does not need to exist, as it only reinforces what we already know to be the case. And the third instance of racism is when Bronwyn's son rudely refers to Arondir as one of them. So the writers apparently considered it of critical importance that racial tensions play a key part in their story, so much so that they dedicated 2 scenes, one in its entirety, plus an additional line of dialogue, into hammering home that elves and men don't like each other. Put simply, they are wasting your time by making sure you understand that there are racial tensions between elves and men. Scene 9 is the black goo in the cow. This scene needed to establish that Arondir is willing to defy authority in the name of love, and it needed to send Arondir and Bronwyn off on their quest. This scene is exceptionally clunky. That Arondir just so happened to visit Bronwyn at the same exact time as the farmer is contrived as hell, and this directly leads to them discovering what happened at Hordern. Also, the writers decided to have Bronwyn just leave her son in order to go to Hordern with Arondir, without so much as a goodbye, which I don't think conveys what the writers thought it conveyed. So all in, this scene is an example of the plot driving the characters rather than the characters driving the plot. I will skip the scene in the barn with the evil sword because this is entirely set up and we learn nothing additional during this scene. Scene 11 is Elrond and Gil-Galad. This scene needed to explain why Gil-Galad sent Galadriel away to Valinor, that he in fact believes Galadriel to be correct in her belief that Sauron still exists, and that Elrond doesn't particularly care about this revelation. It also sets up Elrond working with Celebrimbor, which will presumably be expanded on later. So this scene is quite the revelation. It reveals that, in fact, Galadriel was right all along. Who saw that coming? Even though she had no reason to be. We also learn that Gil-Galad would rather send Galadriel away than have her hunt Sauron, whom he believes to still exist. Whether this makes sense yet kinda depends on what happens with Celebrimbor, but based on the information we have now, it appears that Gil-Galad would rather leave Sauron to do whatever he wants, instead of sending anyone to defeat him. Most critically, though, when Elrond is informed of all of this, his reaction isn't, "Oh snap, my best friend was actually right and I convinced her to leave. I've betrayed her. I am such a moron. Why didn't I believe her? Also, you just lied to me." His reaction instead is one of mild concern.
You believe it does exist. Set your mind at peace about it.
This is more than a little bit jarring, considering he has just learned that the High King, through his gift of foresight, is aware that Sauron still exists. Oh well. Scene 11. This scene needed to establish that something is up with the sky, but more importantly, it needed to establish that Nori is curious and brave and doesn't follow the fucking rules. This is the second scene that's entirely pointless. We have already seen that the Harfoots are superstitious. We have already been told numerous times what Nori's character traits are. The only piece of information we get here is that Sadok, the Harfoot elder, believes that the skies are strange, and this information couldn't have possibly been conveyed earlier. Scene 12 is the discovery of Hordern. This scene needed to establish that Bronwyn was born in Hordern, and that she has close friends and kin in the village whom she considers to be good people whom she knows, and we learn that Hordern has been burned to the ground and appears to be deserted. This right here is why you proofread your scripts. The writers tell us explicitly that Bronwyn has every reason to be emotionally invested in the destruction of Hordern. Not 10 seconds later, the writers tell us that Bronwyn is not emotionally affected by the destruction of Hordern. This is absurd, and this is the kind of nonsense that I imagine people are referring to when they say that this show is bad. There is, however, one additional piece of character information that I found to be noteworthy in this scene, which is that Arondir is willing to risk offending Bronwyn if it means telling the truth. He tells her that the people of Hordern were known to be followers of Morgoth. This doesn't mean much now, but it may come into play later. Scene 13 is the crossing to Valinor. This scene needed to show Galadriel as being extremely conflicted on whether or not to go through with her decision to obey the High King and travel to Valinor, and ultimately that she decides that finishing her quest is more important. This scene is very well presented, green screen aside, with some very nice visuals and some fantastic music. However, as I have already explained, when you peel away the veneer of spending millions of dollars on these superficial technicalities, what we are left with is the sheer absurdity of a character throwing themselves off a ship in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of miles from the shore. This tells us that Galadriel is an idiot, pure and simple. I can only assume that she will not suffer the consequences of her actions, however, and she will be perfectly fine in episode 2. So, that was the first episode of Rings of Power. I think doing any kind of conclusion here is a bit pointless because a lot of this episode was set up for later episodes, but I'll summarize my thoughts for now. I'll be totally honest, if you couldn't tell, this show pissed me the hell off. But because apparently you can't simply say that the show is bad and move on without being called a racist, sexist, review-bombing troll by all of the websites, I thought I'd channel my deep feelings of inadequacy and give a proper in-depth analysis. Is the show being review-bombed? Maybe. Are all of the one-star reviews troll reviews? Maybe. Are all of the people who call the show bad doing it because they are secret racists who don't want the brown elf man because they don't like the brown people? Maybe. Or, just throwing this hot take out there, maybe people are calling the show bad because the show is fucking bad. The characters are almost universally garbage. Galadriel is a perfect embodiment of the strong female character meme in that she is strong, female, and a character, and that's it. Nori has 3 character traits that the show feels the need to remind us of in each and every scene she appears in. Elrond was fine, he's a bit of a ray of sunshine in an otherwise monotonous, gloomy cast of characters. Arondir is very one-note, but I guess he has potential, but I don't know enough about him yet to say if I like him or not. And all we know about Bronwyn is that she prioritizes her elf BF over looking after her child, and she doesn't seem to care whatsoever about the death and destruction of her hometown and the people in it. The visuals are hit and miss, with some shots looking fantastic and others looking far worse than anything in the Peter Jackson movies that, I will remind you, are now 20 years old. God damn it, Fellowship came out when I was 9. I feel old. The music is very good. The writing, however, is trash, as I think I've provided ample evidence for. If any conclusion is necessary at this point, it is this. Amazon have spent an absurd and unprecedented amount of money on creating this series. The elements of filmmaking that generally get better the more money and resources you pump into them, such as the visual effects, the set design, and the costumes, are generally speaking good. The elements that do not directly benefit from Scrooge McDuck levels of cash and instead require talented writers, such as the script, was predictably trash. So I guess the lesson here, which apparently still has not been learned, is that no amount of production value can save a script that resembles moldy Swiss cheese. Well, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I would very much like to continue doing these for episodes 2 and onwards, so if you would like to see that, please consider liking, sharing, or subscribing. If you have any thoughts, if you agree with me or disagree with me or think I missed something, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video.